All right, so we've covered all the terrifying weeds. How do we get rid of them, right? And this is going to be kind of where we're touching on some of our ideas of integrated pest management. Don't use chemicals unless you have exhausted all other strategies, and even then know what you're using and use it as sparingly as possible. So this requires an integrated approach. An ounce of prevention, right, is worth a pound of cure. And the cure can be pretty dastardly. So it's better to stay within the prevention side. And then this is going to include, first, cultural and mechanical control and kind of chemical control as a last resort. So the main way to prevent weeds, right, is to figure out a way to prevent reproduction. So with the annuals, this means you're trying to prevent those seeds from coming in or spreading. You want to hand weed, spray, and mow before seed production, right? So 1 million seeds can fall in your yard, can turn into 1 million plants, but if none of them are able to successfully seed, right, that doesn't impact you going forward into the next year if they're annuals. So for perennials, the simple ones, you can prevent seed and you can start taking out all the different root sections. And so by simple, I mean the ones that just have kind of the more basic root structures, even something like a dandelion, right? If you can get that whole root structure out, you're good to go. And then for the ones with spreading roots, so rhizomes or stolons, or tubers or bulbs, right, you need to be able to get basically that whole thing out. And you have to control the roots as well as the seeds. The seeds are how they get into your yard, the roots is how they stay in your yard. So you kind of have to think about controlling both of those strategies that they have. So how do weeds enter our landscape in the first place?
Neighbor.
A neighbor. So a terrible neighbor or their cat, you know, something. So they enter as seeds, root pieces, or even small plants. So, oh, that great plant that you got from your neighbor because it just looks so good in their yard and you're so excited about it, you just brought in all your neighbor's weeds too, right? Which is great. I mean, maybe it really was a great plant, but just know that you did that. Dirty equipment and tools, wind from an adjacent property, infested topsoil, mulch, compost, plant material. Think about what you're bringing in, you know? Just be aware that you can be bringing in all these other problems.
I have a question about mulch, because I'm specifically looking at something there. If it basically says in the book to get, I don't know whether I actually use the word, I can't remember the word, the medical word.
Sterile?
Sterile, thank you. So when it says that, that can only be the stuff in plastic bags and that has gone through something, right? I can't get that from a local.
Well, so if you go and get it from a local garden center, or if you go and get it from a big box store, wherever it is, and you're getting bulk, like you're getting like a load of mulch in the back of your truck or something,
Yes.
that's from a reputable source. That should be more or less sterile. Sterile plus or minus, right?
Yeah, there's no such thing.
Yeah, but it's going to be a lot better, right? Like what we're talking about is like when you're driving down the road and it says like, fill soil.
Okay, so when you go, when you get a local source that does sell mulch of varying degrees,
Yeah.
I can pretty much, because it
You're
has
pretty much
no
good.
comment on all the time. I know that.
Well,
Yeah, and I can live with
to be
that.
expected.
Yeah, okay. But I can buy that rather than having to buy the bags.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, all of those products like are as sterile as they can get them, right? Because there's no value in major mulch producers selling a product that they tell you to spread, 3 inches deep, and that it's just actually a seed bed. No one would buy that again, right? And so they have a real incentive to kind of keep it clean.
Okay.
Somebody was telling me about the rock shop over on Hillsborough. It's got something called certified mulch.
Yeah.
What was certified?
I don't know.
Compost, maybe certified compost.
They do have certified compost, and that's getting it to a certain temperature and kind of all these like control processes on what's getting into their product. I don't know. I would have to just read their literature, but again, it's easier.
Well, I was just going to say related to that they do have playground certified mulch. So,
Yeah, and that's probably a sourcing issue of where it's coming from.
At the rock shop, I believe they've also tested for certain things.
Yeah. Well, because of who they're getting it from. But so anyway, mulch from any of those sources should be, yeah. I don't. The mulch that the city of Durham provides, I don't know about it. I mean, any of these, if you're curious, I would really spend a little bit of time digging down and seeing what they're doing and how they're sterilizing it. Yeah.
Regarding that, you may have
Yeah.
As well as provide feedback.
Yeah, and so certified compost and certified mulch, or I don't know if they're certified mulch, but they're slightly different beasts. But just be aware, right? And again, what I'm really talking about here is the distinction of something that you get that's a product that has like some provenance, like you have some idea of where it came from, as opposed to like, my neighbor doesn't want this mulch anymore. You know, then I'd be like, maybe, you know, you're rolling the dice. And so this kind of all gets this broader idea of prevention through sanitation and keeping your space clean, keeping your tools clean, keeping what you're bringing in clean. So weed seed and root pieces can cling to equipment and tools. And so even if you're moving, you know, if you have part of your yard that's totally infested with weeds and you have a big enough lot and you have another part of your yard that's not, if I was working in the garden, I would always start in the area that was not infested, work my way toward the infested area, and then clean my tools at the end. Right? Because even your walking can spread things. Just being kind of mindful of how you're moving through the space even. Yes? You could use something like ethanol. You could even just make sure you're kind of wiping everything down, taking a good look at the, I mean, mowers or blades are hard. All that machinery is hard. I think you just have to be aware of how you're doing it. Yeah. It's hard though, right? And birds. You can't clean a bird that flies over your property. So like you just... Yeah, and that's what Matt was saying, was Lysol was fine, ethanol, you know, a 70% solution of ethanol, and you can just spray it down, and that's all nice. Okay, so in terms of, another good way to prevent weeds is just don't bring them in. So weed seeds are often present in container plants. Like I'm sure we have all picked up a container plant that looked more or less like this, right? And you're just like, well, I'm just gonna hope for the best, you know. So as long as the tree survives, I guess this was a good deal. Even balled and burlap root balls often harbor different seeds and different plants. Be aware of gift plants and especially be aware of topsoil that you're not sure about. All of this is to say, right, like life is full of a million risks. And if you really wanted that tree, I mean, I would take it. I would just kind of figure out what to do on the back end.
Whole weeds where you buy it.
Yeah, I do like doing that. And so one of the major sources of weed seed that I think a lot of people are not actually aware of is on their seed mixes for grass. And so if you look on any label for grass, you're going to see, like any bag of grass seed has to have this sort of labeling where they tell you not only, so for creeping red fescue, this is 14.72%. It has a germination rate of 85%. That's really important to check on your germination rate. Some of them will have quite low germination rates. It's not so great to buy something like that, right? Because most of the seed you're buying, or a good portion of the seed you're buying, is not viable. And so that's kind of what's going on here at the top. But then in this section right here, so there's inert matter from seed, but there's also weed seed, 0.05%. Luckily, there's no noxious weed seeds, so none of the truly terrible ones. But just know that, like, while you're picking your grass seed, it's really good to be focusing on not only which cultivars and which types of grass do you want for our region, but also trying to find a blend that really, really minimizes this weed seed. Because if you can imagine, right, if you apply, 30 pounds of weed seed and 0.05% is, or of grass seed and 0.05% is weed, you've applied really a lot of weed seed, right? Like an almost shocking amount of weed seed. So just be aware of that. Always check your bags. Always try to be minimizing that number. And you'll see a lot of times, even if you go to a big box store and you're looking for a fescue blend or something like that, the lower end blends, the less expensive ones, will often have higher weed seed percentages. And that's kind of what you're paying for, is you're paying for that sort of like cleanliness. So just, it's a balance and you make that choice.
Is the same true for mag soil and mulches?
I don't find that to be true, but who knows if you run into a bad batch.
Is there a particular percentage?
I find there's not a particular percent. I try to find the lowest percent I can find, but you have to balance it with getting cultivars that are right for your area. Not all fescue is the same, but we'll get to that in the turf section.
But if you buy topsoil and a truckload and not in bags, that can have a lot of seeds.
Yeah, I can, but I mean, again, a lot of those products should go through some amount of sterilization, but there's only so much that can be done. So, yeah, this is your best strategy actually for dealing, right, with a lot of these annual weed seeds, is mulch. It only does prevent annuals. it's very hard to get the amount of mulch that would take out a perennial, right? Because that's its whole goal, is to get through a layer of dirt above it. But it prevents light. It prevents germination. Be careful while you're mulching, because disturbing the soil can lead to weed germination. So you kind of want to just be applying basically top dressing. You need 3% of organic mulch, so this is things like bark, or 3 inches of organic mulch, so this is things like bark or straw, and you need 2 inches of inorganic, so things like rock or crushed brick. Most of us, I think, are going to be working with organic mulches, so you actually do need a pretty thick layer on there to prevent that annual germination, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like for most seeds, like the story of early life is I need to get through some amount of dirt. So you have to put a level on top of them that is more than kind of what they have the energy reserve to get through. I wouldn't bother with landscape fabric. It's not really worth it. You're going to spend a lot of time and energy putting it down, and then you're going to put mulch on top. The mulch is going to break down because we have earthworms, and then you've got a nice seed soil, right? Earthworm enriched. You're going to probably keep putting mulch down, and you have a beautiful, wonderful, enriched soil on top of your landscape fabric. And so it's not what I would do.
I moved into a place that had, in some places, 2 layers of landscape fabric.
Awesome.
And I'm not fighting it, because as the yard shifted and the bed shifted, I now have lawn over what was formerly a flower bed, and so there's landscape fabric on the lawn. It's absolutely incredible how years of mulch degraded into soil, which is now buried the stuff even deeper. And it's in great condition. We obviously bought a really expensive product, but it has formed an incredibly tight barrier between all of that organic matter on the top, and then underneath it's just the
Yep.
sheet of clay.
Yeah.
So
And
there's
if
no
you
incorporation happening, there's nothing good happening.
And that's another excellent point, actually, is that, right, like if you think about our clay soils, one of the best things you can do to help our clay soils is incorporating organic content, right? That's actually one of the things that can really kind of ameliorate a lot of the problems of our clay soils. And so if you put a barrier down to make sure that, like, between clay and, like, organic, never the two shall meet, you know, I mean, good luck. It's gonna look good for about 6 weeks.
A landscaper recently told me that as the mulch degrades, it can actually form a barrier that prevents water absorption, while it just runs off, and that you need to like break up the
Yeah.
mulch.
Yeah, if it starts getting crusty, and you can kind of tell when it's happening, just go through and break it up a little bit, because you're trying to prevent things from coming up. Yeah, like you're not trying to prevent things from going down, right?
Yeah. And so then does that disturb its ability to keep down the weeds?
Not the weeds. That's a water infiltration problem, right? Yeah.
I was in Europe and they just use wheat mold. They don't use mulch. And it's a foreign thing. This is just invented by us just so that we can keep weeds down because we grow.
Well, but they're using an organic mulch, right? They're using leaves. They're
Yeah,
letting them drop. That's their organic mulch.
They're not using them.
But that's just it's a different type of mulch, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm probably for
More
that.
aerobic,
I think it's great.
I think it's great. I mean, I leave my leaves down.
So if you let them down the roots, don't grow. You always get rid of them because I don't want them to grow, the roots grow back in or whatever.
Oh yeah, I mean, I leave them down just because it's like you're. Well, let's talk about that more. Let's talk about some of this more at the end. Or come talk to me at the break, and I can like give you my theory on this. But it's fine. Just mulch. Yeah. Okay. To make the point, right? So this is bare ground. This is mulched at the end of the season, right? Significantly better. And this was a trial that I assume was done by Dr. Neal at NC State. This is one of his slides that he always uses. This makes a huge difference. Kind of to drive the point home even more, if you look at the mulching depth, so along this axis, you know, you have the number of inches of mulch that you applied. Here you have the percent weed cover at the end of the season. If you didn't apply mulch, you have 90% weed cover on the soil. You're totally overgrown. If you applied 3 inches of mulch, you're like 25% weed cover, right? And so, you know, sure, 6 inches is better, but like we have a budget, right? Like, and we have like backs that we're not trying to destroy. So 3 inches, this is kind of why they make that recommendation, right? That's really where you see the real drop off in weed cover. To a point. Again, remember how you mulch around your trees. It's This is kind of the thing we have to keep impressing upon people, like, it's a donut.
Yeah.
Mulch in a donut. Okay. So one of the ways you can prevent weeds is composting, but this is not for everyone. And the reason I say that is because you have to get the compost pile up to 150 degrees. And you do that with, like, you're testing with a thermometer. If you're not getting your compost pile up to 150 degrees that you can verify and you're turning it regularly, you don't actually have a compost pile. You have rotting vegetables in your yard, which is fine. But, like, know that you're not getting a lot of the benefits in terms of sterilization. And so if you're not reaching that 150 degrees, I would keep it to a rotting vegetable pile. I would not turn it into a rotting vegetable and weed pile. Just keep them separate. And in that case, you know, this is like a diseased plant or anything else. I would just be trying to get them off the property. So take them to the, you know, yard waste disposal or whatever. In terms of mechanical means for preventing weeds, tiller or hoe. This is the model that was kind of recommended by the book, but it's anything that allows you to really just skim the lightest little bit of the surface. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to hit those baby weeds, pull out their roots, but you're not trying to disturb anything underneath. Because again, every time you disturb that soil, the annual seed bank is like, oh, this is my moment. And they just go nuts. Yeah, shallow. Shallow, shallow, shallow. And this can propagate perennial weeds because you can oftentimes be cutting and redistributing little bits of fruit. So it's kind of awesome. Or you can just be burying them in. This is kind of an interesting one, the stale seed bed technique, and it kind of takes advantage of that idea that every time you mess with the seed bank, right, you're going to get more and more coming up. So basically what you do is you intentionally kind of rough up the top inch or so of soil. You wait a while for everything to germinate, and then you knock it out either with a little bit of light cultivation again, or if you're feeling dramatic and you feel like you really need to go that extra step, you could do an herbicide, but I would start with light cultivation. So basically you would hoe it, you know, an inch or two, you would wait for it to come up, and then you would take it and you would hoe just the very top, skimming it. And you can do that a couple times just to kind of like start trying to deplete the seed bank. I think this could work. I think it would make you feel good probably, but again, like a seed bank is really a hard thing to deal with, and we're all dealing with it all the time. So this will work for a while, but like you could be dealing with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of seeds. So just, I would try it, but pruning and mowing is actually a really, really, really good way to prevent a lot of stuff. And this is because you're preventing you're not allowing the plant to build up as much biomass, right? Like you're not allowing the plant to get as big, so it's already having a hard time, because most plants, they have to get to a certain size to be able to produce flowers. So you're preventing that step. And then if they produce flowers, you're preventing the flowers from going to seed, because you're knocking them off. So just staying on top of the mowing, staying on top of all that other stuff is actually really, really a good way to take care of this. Hand weeding works. It does work, but it's hard, and you have to really stay on top of it. It's very labor intensive compared to a lot of these other methods. It's really much better suited to small beds, and you have to make sure you get the roots. So yeah.
I was just going to say, Stone Brothers sells a really nice tool. It's a fork with a little curved metal piece underneath that you can use the leverage to really, if you're doing hand weeding.
Oh yeah, if you've ever used like an actual dandelion digger,
Yeah.
you know, they're a beautiful
I
thing.
mean, it's just going-
Yeah.
It's really good.
So hand weeding, one thing I'll say for it, right, takes out annuals and perennials alike. It's effective, but it just is very labor intensive. So in terms of cultural methods, so kind of like what are our best practices? Ideally, begin with a weed-free bed.
Yeah.
I thought this was funny. I liked that one because I was like, in a perfect world. Yeah. Like, treat all perennial weeds before planting. So this is something that, you know, if you're setting up a new bed, what we know about perennials, right, is that they can have these really, really intense root structures. So even though it's good to kind of keep tilling to a minimum once you're already set up, when you're setting up a bed, it's nice to take and actually turn large portions of the bed, because that's how you can really find those perennial root structures and pull them out, right? That's your best time to do that. You're not going to go through and pull out all the English ivy roots after you put in all your flowers, right? Doesn't make sense. And also, in terms of just cultural methods, you really want to just give your desired plants the best possible conditions for optimal growth, right? So if the soil is not getting sun, if the soil is not getting excess amounts of water, weeds aren't going to germinate as well. And if they do germinate, they're not going to thrive, right? Because all plants need water and sun. And so this is something, that you might think about is watering only the desirable plants. And this is really where things like soaker hoses and drip irrigation come into play. Right? If you're only basically applying water in a targeted way to the plants you want, the rest of the soil is not going to support germination as well. You're not going to have as many weeds. All right. We had to get here. Yeah.
Can you talk for a second about solarization?
Yeah.
The book sort of said don't do it.
Yeah.
Why?
So I think the reason is that people actually have a really hard time getting the temperatures as high as they need them. They have a hard time, and even then it's like it's only taking out the very top little bit where it's heating up. So it's like if you can get the temperature where you need it, it's only going to take out the top little bit. And it's kind of in the same way, a similar maybe critique that you could have about the stale seed bed technique, which is that, yeah, you're taking out this little layer, but the whole thing is still there. The whole rest of the seed bank is still there, and you're going to have trouble getting the temperature where you need it anyway. So.
We'll talk about a flamethrower.
Oh, don't worry, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. Like if you just want the most metal way to do your gardening, okay. So, and the one thing I will say about the book, and this chapter specifically, is that basically all the graphs you're going to see in this were taken from a presentation by Dr. Neal, who wrote this chapter, and he is our lead science specialist. And so I'm willing to defer slightly to the book too, even if Dr. Neal doesn't describe it totally clearly. I'd be like, this is what he does, and so he might have, you know what I mean? That's kind of a hand-wavy answer, but just to speak highly of the author of the chapter, I guess. Okay, so in terms of herbicides, there is a reason you use them, there is a reason you get to them, and so if you think about it, weed control is actually the hardest part of organic farming, right? Because they don't have the same tools in their arsenal. This is something that's really, really hard to do and take care of without some amount of kind of chemical intervention. But knowing that, you have to really know what you're doing, you have to be careful about what you're doing, and you have to be thoughtful about what you're doing. So you have to really know what the weeds and desirable plants that you're dealing with, what you're trying to take out, what you're really trying to protect. You have to use the appropriate chemical, apply it at the most effective time and at the proper rate. Remember, Paul took us through, how to read one of those sheets. Every single time before you even buy the product, you should be looking at those sheets. You should know exactly what it is. And if you look at that sheet and you think, I don't know, don't buy it. Go home, do some more research, and see if it's actually what you're looking for or not, right? Or call me. I will always talk you through that. Yeah, always read and follow the label directions. So some of the terms we're going to go through for herbicides today, we're going to talk about the difference between pre-emergent and post-emergent herbicides. Within the post-emergent herbicides, we're going to talk about the difference between contact and systemic, and we're also going to kind of talk broadly, this really shouldn't be nested, it should be over here. We're going to talk broadly about the difference between selective and non-selective herbicides. And so these are all kind of things you need to keep in mind when you're looking at herbicides, is, when does it impact the plant, how does it impact the plant, and how specific is it in its impacts, is basically what we're talking about here. So the pre-emergent herbicides, they prevent weed seed from germinating. The reason I'm putting that in quotes, even though it's not here, I'm putting it in air quotes, is because they actually basically kill the plant at the very first stage after it germinates, and so it's like it prevents it from germinating. Timing is very, very important. These don't kill something that has leaves on it, right? It must be applied before germination. And a lot of times they must be watered in, and we have a slide that kind of demonstrates why that is. And what they do is basically you apply them, they're often granular, and they basically form almost like a seal in the top couple inches of soil. They can last for 10 to 12 weeks. So know, right, that means you have a residual activity. You have something that's kind of staying around in the soil, has activity. And you have to know which weeds you're targeting. So some of the major pre-emergent herbicides that you might be familiar with are some of the different green products. They're usually granular, although this is kind of interesting. This is a mulch that has a pre-emergent in it. I don't know. I think it's safe. I'm sure it's a fine product, but I think that's a little bit of like a heavy-duty approach. It's a shotgun approach. These are for landscape or vegetable beds, so things like green or treflin, sorghum, and they mainly control annual grasses and small-seeded annual broadleaves. So a lot of times you will see a recommendation to put down pre-emergence in the fall for a fescue lawn, and then now you'll actually see a recommendation to put down a pre-emergent around this time for crabgrass. But most of the things that will take out the crabgrass will actually also take out broadleaves. So if you look at the label, you'll see it's a recommendation for a number of different things. Yeah, and so for many of the ones that are crabgrass preventers, this is going to be things like, all these chemical names that I'm sure you guys are just going to remember right off the top of your head every time you go to see it. But these are fine products, This is a good way to help your lawn. The best thing that can ever help your lawn is a strong, healthy lawn. However, we are in the worst place in the world for lawns, so that's an uphill battle. Yeah, think about something else. Think about non-lawn. So a little bit on how the pre-emergents kind of are working. They're preventing seedling establishment. And so what you can see here is this is kind of a mock-up, like this is the pre-emergent, it's creating that little barrier. And this is kind of the point I was making earlier, is that actually this little leaf does emerge. It just gets killed, basically, in the first instant. And so these are not preventing germination, they're killing like the second after germination. Because, sidebar, when a plant is in a seed, right, it's super protective. That's the whole point of a seed. These chemicals have trouble getting in, but the moment that thing opens up and it's kind of ready to go, it's exposed, it's vulnerable, and that's kind of when you can attack it. But as you can see here with this broadleaf that's coming up, right, it's below that barrier that was created. It's fine. It doesn't care. Like it's going right through. So just know that these are only working to a certain depth. So that's kind of an overview of some of the pre-emergent herbicides and how they work. So like in this area, there's a recommendation that you would put down pre-emergent herbicides before the dogwood bloom. And if you see weeds, even tiny weeds in your yard, you are not in pre-emergent territory anymore. Like, move on. You have missed your pre-emergent window. Yeah.
So, I got ragweed in my yard already.
Yeah.
And so when they say, usually around March is where when the pre-emergent stuff. So what if you've got ragweeds in New York and it's in January and in February?
So the value of pre-emergent there, right, is that that stuff's dropping seed like crazy. And so the pre-emergent is going to help you for the next generation. It's not going to kill the plants you have, but it will help you kind of moving forward. But even then, I mean, a lot of these plants, like I said, they hit the ground running. So if you're thinking about a pre-emergent that has a 10 to 12 week residual in the soil, and that thing drops a seed that decides to wait 4 months to germinate, it doesn't care that you put down pre-emergent, right? Like it's just going for it. It doesn't. So
I can't spray them because the stuff it says it's got to be up above a certain temperature
right.
to put the stuff out. So it's like, hey, it's in the 30s, it's in the 40s, and it's like.
I would make sure that
you wait for it to grow and.
At this point, I think that it's a good strategy to be mowing, right? To be keeping those seed heads off until you can get to a different strategy. But, yeah. Okay, so for post-emergent herbicides, these are herbicides for after the plant has emerged. They are applied typically to the foliage as a spray. So the pre-emergents a lot of times are granulars. The post-emergents a lot of times are sprays. They can be less effective when there's plant stress, either drought or cold, and that's because a lot of times a lot of them do have to kind of move through the plant. We'll talk about that more with systemic herbicides. But so if the plant is kind of slowed down because metabolism is low because of drought or cold, they won't work quite as well. And this is really kind of the major take home. There's a reason it is bolded twice, and even when I will do this, they're most effective on young, actively growing plants. And when I say young, I mean if you look at your yard and you think, I see tiny baby plants, oh shit, I've missed pre-emergent. That's the best time for one of these, right? Like these are really good, mature, healthy plants can fight off a lot of these, or at least there's some rate. And so, for example, if you think about it, right, you've got a lawn full of weeds, they're big, they're robust, and you spray something, and one survives. Super plant, selection, evolution in action, right? So yeah, and so just be aware that it's not really worth using any of these chemicals if you're not timing them right, because that's how we get resistance, right? That's how we get environmental problems too. So they're not as effective immediately after mowing. They generally are applied between 60 and 85 degrees, so now is not the right time of year for these, for the most part. Although, you know, who knows what it'll be like next week. And most of the time you want 6 hours before rainfall or irrigation, and this is because a lot of these things have to sit on the leaf and do some sort of damage or move through the plant, so if they're just going to wash right off, you've just wasted kind of your time and money. So when we think about herbicides, there are a number of different terms. In addition to pre- and post-emergent that you should really keep in mind, this is things like contact, so this is something that's going to kill what it touches. Basically, these are typically things that almost like burn the leaves. And they're mainly effective on small annual weeds, because if you can imagine you have a big kind of healthy, robust plant, you spray a contact herbicide so you burn all the leaves, it has enough resources to just make new leaves. Like, it doesn't really care. You've set it back, but like, it's fine. So this is going to be something like scythe, which is hyaluronic acid. Diquat is another one that you might see kind of bandied around. And also vinegar, which is an organic option. I don't know, man. I know that, like, so vinegar is going to be, it can be quite expensive, especially to get some of the organic formulations. They are contact herbicides, which are not always my favorite anyway. And it's just burning the leaves, and it's...
If you use surfactant, does it take it, it's not systemic, when vinegar is not systemic?
It's not systemic. It's a burn. Yeah, and so if the plants were small enough, and if you were committed, you might have good luck, right? But know that, again, this is just going to have the same problems that all these other ones are, where if that plant is big and healthy, it's not strong enough, right? This is, yeah.
You have to get the higher percentage of acid.
That would help, and there are also, like, formulations you can find for it, and it's just one of those things where that's kind of the face I would give you, like, sure, I mean, it's your yard.
So did we decide that the flamethrower wasn't a good idea?
Oh, we'll get to it. We decided we'll get to it. You guys, we got it. Come on.
Sounds like fun.
Come on.
This is a proposed bill.
Okay, so as opposed to contact, we have systemic. And this is going to be a lot of what we see, because this is one of the old tried and trues. This is glyphosate. This is Roundup. So these are translocated by the plant to the root system. So even though you apply them on the leaves, they actually move basically all the way down, and they're hitting, it's not that they're burning the leaves, it's that they are like hitting some of the energy powerhouses and some of the growth powerhouses of the plant, and they're basically shutting the thing down. They are most effective when plants are actively growing. Again, that's because of that translocation aspect, right? It needs to move through the plant, so it's best if the plant's actively growing. So it's after rainfall, when there are moderate temperatures. They don't act as quickly as contact herbicides. It can take several days to see effect, and this is the reason a lot of people don't like these products, is because you spray it and you come back that afternoon and you're like, it looks the same. Like, that plant just got a death sentence, you know, like, it's just going to take a minute to see what happened. And most of the herbicides that we use are systemic, and this is because most of the herbicides we use are glyphosate. So there's a reason it's a tried and true one. So within the systemic herbicides, you'll see selective, and so this can only kill certain plants. There are things that only kill grasses, for example, only kill monocots. So this will be, Vantage and Fusillade. There are things that are only going to kill sedges. So this is kind of interesting because it's a specificity even within the grasses, within the monocots. And then, of course, there are things that are only going to kill broadleaf. So Weed Be Gone, three-way spray, a lot of things with pre- and post-emergent activity. Dicamba is one you might see. 2,4-D is one you might see. 2,4-D is kind of interesting because this is actually, it's like an artificial auxin, I think. So it's like an artificial plant growth hormone that basically just like glitches the plant out. And so the cool thing about a lot of these selective ones is that if you have a bunch of broadleaf weeds in your lawn,
It must change the amino acid, right? What is it, the D or L image, it must change.
the isomer,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't even know chemistry.
Sounds like.
So, and in the same way that if you have a bunch of sedges and a flower bed, right, this is a way that you can target just those things. And these are really cool that way, actually, right? That's in contrast to something that will be a non-selective, and it's just going to kill most plants. It's going to kill most green tissue. So a lot of these are even going to take out mosses. They're going to take out things that don't, which is interesting because the moss doesn't have the same vascular structure that the higher plants do, and yet these will still take out a lot of them. It's going to be things like glyphosate, so Roundup. It's systemic. It moves throughout the plant, and timing is very important for the control of perennial and woody plants because you need to basically be hitting it when it's moving, translocating resources the most. Also, Diquat. This is a contact one, which is nice. It kills only what it's applied to. It doesn't kind of, hit the soil and kill everything else. And you can selectively apply these. So a lot of these, they're going to kill everything, but if you're really careful about how you apply them, and so you'll see all sorts of kind of like people taking, their Roundup and a tiny brush. If they've got tiny plants they're trying to take up, the Roundup on a wick, so you can wick it down to just exactly where you're going. We're going to see kind of a jerry-rigged contraption for doing that also later.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Is the time issue the reason why Roundup doesn't seem to work on some things like bindweed and duckweed and vicious weed?
Yeah.
Some things are just really stubborn.
There's-
Will it work if you get the timing right, or are they resistant in another way?
There are some things that are becoming resistant to Roundup, but those are not ones that I've heard as much about. A lot of times what happens is, so things like pigweed can have a resistance, but it's because people come and they apply it when this plant is just like a monster, right? And it's got kind of enough reserves built up that it can make it through. So again, it's that thing about applying it early. If the plant is strong, it can fight, and it will. Yeah.
Actually, had a recent case study guy won, I think, $6 million
Sure.
because of
Oh.
because it determined that there was a positive effect and an association between the use of Roundup and its lymphoma.
A jury decided.
Yeah, so
And that's,
there is a jury still called.
well, yeah. A jury of his peers is different than a panel of scientists.
That's right.
I mean, and we can, let's not open that can of worms.
Well, I just wanted to mention one thing, it also
Yeah.
has to do with, if it gets in the groundwater and there's aquatic roundups and it spreads.
Yeah.
And the other thing, especially, say you can spray on like suckers or water sprouts and trees and
I wouldn't. I mean, you could try, but I wouldn't. Yeah.
I mean, it seems like a common thing.
Yeah.
Latin.
Okay. I would be careful with it, right? I think Roundup is glyphosate is a relatively safe product. We have a lot of good science saying that there's a very low probability that it will cause problems. I wouldn't be glib about it, though. You know what I mean? Yeah.
You can actually, with the Roundup, you can actually put some dishwasher liquid into your Roundup, and it'll help stick to the plant that you're wanting to kill.
Yeah. It's also got a lot of surfactants already in the mix, though. Yeah, and so this is kind of our most typical non-selective thing, right? It's going to be Roundup. So let's just move on to herbicide application methods. So we have directed applications, and this is the idea of how do you get something that's kind of a broad killer to only kill specific things. But here you can see, right, basically that they wanted this circle around this tree, this mulch circle, and it's hard to see, but there's all this brown grass right in here, right? That was a targeted application. They were careful not to walk through that and then walk through the grass. Otherwise, you would have seen little footprints moving away too. And also painting or wiping. And so this is a kind of a common one where it's people go with little brushes. Farmers will have basically wipers that just basically go along and brush the tops of certain plants because they know everything above this height is a problem. So if I set my wiper here, got it, right? I liked this. This is a gallon jug over the end of a spray nozzle to direct it. You could have also put that over the plant you didn't want sprayed. So this is a good way to get kind of a much more directed spray. And again, think about things like drift. Think about things like wind. Think about how you're applying these things, when you're applying them, what your spray size is, because all of that can cause problems. So some notes on some of the different formulations of glyphosate. So a lot of times you'll see these rapid action formulations. This will be things like glyphosate and dicot, glyphosate and hyaluronic acid, glyphosate mixed with something. Landscapers and consumers really like these because these are contact herbicides. So they burn the leaves, right? So they have a rapid action, so you burn the leaf and it looks like you have really knocked it out much more quickly than if you just applied glyphosate. Think about it though. How does glyphosate work? So it needs to move through, right? So if you killed the leaves because you wanted it to look good right away, because nothing looks better than a dead leaf, right? These can cause problems. They look effective. They often are not as effective in trials. I would stick with something that is just glyphosate. Also, some of these can cause problems on their own, right? You are using 2 chemicals when you only need to use 1. Okay, great. Extended control. This is another formulation you will see, and I will admit, I have bought these before, and I've recently taken them to hazardous waste disposal because I don't need this stuff in my yard. So a lot of times you'll see glyphosate paired with something that has a soil residual activity. So it can be, you'll see Roundup Extended. This is one I think we've all seen. Durham. This is another product that is basically glyphosate-based. Has dicot, so it has that nice contact. We're already off to a good start, right? And it has indazapam, which has a soil residual. And so these are slides from Dr. Neal coming up that I thought were really interesting. So Roundup Extended Control, what's the point? The point is that you could have applied it around the base of the spore petalum, like they did here, and you have a really nice extended control, right? You can see some grasses coming up, you can see some weeds coming up. This thing, it's protected for a while. Some of these last up to a year. That should be terrifying in itself, but right, that's how they advertise them. However, the problem with those chemicals with residual activity, right, so this one's a little bit better formulated. It seems fine. These are formulated, though, with secondary chemicals that they can move in the soil, too, right? So they are able to spread a little bit beyond where you thought they would be. They have a residual activity. They can have root impacts. Similarly on this Lirio, right, so this was taken 9 months later. It's the same plant. And so Durazone is a slightly better formulation where that particular secondary chemical doesn't have as much soil mobility, but this is made with one that had a higher soil mobility, and so it was able to hit the Lirio too. And this is something I think maybe even Charlotte talked about, was a lot of times you'll see Roundup damage much later. You'll see it the next year. Kind of one more. This is the idea of like, I have this plant and I want, a clear ground around the base of it. And I don't want to mulch, which would be a reasonable way to go about doing that. I want to apply a chemical. And you can see, right, it's just knocked it down. So just be aware of a lot of these things. If you have a gravel driveway, that you want to stay a gravel driveway forever, these might be good options. Maybe. But if you have a bed that you're trying to keep clear, things that kill plants, right? Like you have a bed of plants.
So the same doesn't happen when you just use glyphosate because it breaks down quickly.
Yeah, so what it's actually doing is it's bound up with the clays and organic contents of the soil. And that sounds scary, but it actually basically totally immobilizes it and it's done. Like it has no soil activity.
Is that what's referred to when you say like half-life? Is that?
Yeah, so they get bound up by the soil and the chemical breaks down over time. So it's bound up, it can't have action, but then its half-life is, after this period of time, half of it's degraded, right?
Which basically means if it gets bounded up in because if it gets found and it has no chemical reaction anymore, a runoff could also not be
I wouldn't.
dangerous.
I wouldn't be worried about. I wouldn't be worried about the runoff. Yeah. So glyphosate injury severity depends on species and the season of application. So deciduous plants are going to have greater damage in late summer or fall, and conifers are going to be more sensitive in the spring. So even then, right, if you're spraying something down here and it's a windy day and it blows over there, you're going to see that damage and you're going to see that impact. So I think we're pretty close. So we're gonna 5 more minutes. Okay. So woody weeds, glyphosate can be effective. It kind of takes a slightly different strategy though. So the timing of the year can be very important. So for deciduous plants, you want to knock them in August through September. As you can imagine, that's kind of when they're getting ready to go dormant. That's when they're storing a lot of energy. That's when they're storing a lot of time. So if you knock them back in April, they have time to make another go of it, right? If you knock them back here, they don't have time to do it again before the fall, and also you've taken out all those reserves that they were putting away. And for evergreens, it's kind of April to May, around the time that they're really gearing up for the next coming season. Hand weeding when small is extremely important, and once they're large, they're much more difficult to remove. The way I would do it is when you're knocking them back, you can treat a fresh cut stump. So if you cut a stump, there are chemicals that you can apply right to that cut stump, and that's kind of the best way to go about things. And one of the main ones that you'll see used is triclopyr. That's the chemical that you'll find in a lot of brush killers. It's also a nice one because it doesn't have soil activity, or at least so nominal soil activity that's not a problem. So if you apply this to the stump, you're killing the stump. And so what I would do is I often have kind of the spray bottle with me, so I'm like clipping with one, and then I go back there and I spray the stumps, and it's kind of the best way to knock it out, because otherwise all you've done is, if you remember your little botany primer, is all you've done is you've taken off this meristem all the way up here, and you've sent a signal down here to say, hey, go out in all the other directions, right? You're a Medusa. And then, don't worry, chemical alternatives. Flame weeders. I have not used one. I consider that a real shortcoming for my life. This is especially good in paths. This is especially good in gravel. I wouldn't do it near my brush pile. I wouldn't do it on a hot, dry day. That's the only reason I'm a little bit hesitant about flame weeders, is because know what you're doing. Be aware. Know where the hose is. But you can find these basically online, anywhere. A lot of times they're propane or butane. They're nice. It's pretty cool, right? Like, a lot of what we do with gardening is just because it's cool. So with that, we kind of got into our major chemical control ideas, and so I'm going to say we should take our big break.